What makes a fish really memorable? Why do some of our catches stick out in our minds so much more than others? Is it always due to size? I mean, don't get me wrong, I love big fish just as much as the next guy, but does a special fish always have to be a big one? See, most often, I think it's the entire process of catching a fish that makes it so special. The drive or hike to the water, spotting and stalking that rising fish, or scoping out a likely looking run, or tossing a great cast and making a perfect hook set, or even falling in and going full on river runs through it to land that fish. If you want that kind of experience for yourself, then you've come to the right place. On this episode of Untangled, I'm going to walk you through a step-by-step guide to help you land a fish that you will never forget. This is Untangled, fly fishing for everyone, presented by Ventures Fly Co. Hey everybody, welcome to it. This is Untangled and I am your host, Spencer Durant. Today's show is going to be a little bit different than normal because instead of diving into the nuts and bolts on how to do something or a specific technique, I thought, especially with the topic of how do we catch a memorable fish? How do we go out there and have an experience that's really unforgettable? I thought the best way to teach that, aside from an actual step-by-step guide, which I have, and we'll get into that later, but the best way to teach that is just telling some stories and showing those steps in action. And I want to tell these stories of some fish that I've caught recently that really stick out in my mind, that really, they meet the criteria for me of unforgettable fish, because these are 5 fish that I just caught to actually complete a little fishing challenge here in the state of Wyoming. It's the Trophy Angler program. It's a pretty fun little challenge, and how it works is you've just got to catch 5 fish. It can be any of the fish that live in Wyoming, but they've all got to be a certain length to qualify for the challenge. So the brown trout, for example, has got to be 23 inches. Well, that's a big brown, bro. But then the rainbow's got to be 20 inches, and the whitefish and the golden trout, and I think the brook trout all have to be 16 inches as well to qualify to get you into this Trophy Angler program. So once you've caught your 5 fish that hit the length qualifications for everything, then you send in the details on when and where you caught it, and you include a picture with it. And then the Wyoming Game and Fish, they send you this fancy little challenge coin. I've actually got mine right here. I have no idea what I'm going to do with it, but look at that's fancy stuff right there, folks. If you're not watching the video podcast, you are missing out. It's a cool little coin. So they send you that, and then for every fish that you catch that meets the length, you become a master angler for that species. So they also send you a sticker, so they look just like this. And I've got them for the 5 here that got me into the Trophy Angler program. And it's just a fun little challenge. I really enjoy these sorts of things. And as I thought through how I wanted to do the show this week, it just clicked that I've got to tell the story of these 5 fish, because they really do stick out in my mind a lot. It wasn't just I'm going to go do this master angler or trophy angler thing. It was something that I heard about right when I first moved to Wyoming, and it's been a goal of mine to do ever since. And I just recently finished it up, and each of these fish is really special. So I thought, what better way to talk about this topic of catching fish that you never forget than fish that I didn't forget. So without further ado, let's get through it. I'm going to tell the story of each of these fish, and then at the end, we'll wrap up with the step-by-step guide on how to do something like this on your own. The first fish to talk about is the lake trout. Now, I've got to preface this story by telling you I don't like ice fishing, and I know our Midwest listeners probably going to find that sacrilegious, blasphemous. I'm sorry, I apologize. I've given it a really good try. I've had friends take me ice fishing. I've had folks promise that I'd love it. And I've had some days that I disliked less than others, but I don't enjoy it. I like to be moving and active when I'm fishing, and ice fishing involves a lot of sitting around and waiting. Well, my first year as a teacher, I was teaching in Evanston, Wyoming. And if any of you have been there, you know it's a little town in the southwest corner of Wyoming. And one of the other English teachers there at the school I was teaching at was also a big-time fisherman. But he really, really loves to ice fish. And even though I'd sworn it off, I said, I'm never ice fishing again. he finally convinced me to do it because he invites me into his room one day. He's like, "Hey, Durant, come here." So I go into his classroom and he's showing me these pictures of these giant lake trout. I mean, lake trout that are so big, you can't even wrap two arms around them, right? It looks like you're trying to hug Santa and your arms can't reach behind his back because he's so fat. Lake trout that big, just so big they look fake. And when he showed me those pictures, he said, "Yeah, we catch these ice fish." And I said, "All right, I'll give it a shot. I'll give it one more try. I'll go out and ice fish." So we put a request in for subs. We went and played hooky, and we headed off to Flaming Gorge Reservoir. We've got a great lake trout fishery. But my buddy, he's got this secret spot out there on the reservoir where he always catches those giant lakers through the ice. So we get out there. I haul this sled out on the ice. I set up the tent. I cut the hole, and I was so excited. I was shaking. I was ready to do it. We caught nothing for like 6 hours. Only one other person in our group, there were a few of us that went, he caught like a 30-incher right off the bat, which is a great fish, but it's not the huge lake trout that I was seeing pictures of, not the 4-footers that I was seeing pictures of. So it was a really frustrating day, especially for my buddy, because he was seeing this bust happen. He's seeing the skunk going on, and he didn't want that because he knew how much I disliked ice fishing. Well, we make this last-ditch effort before leaving. We go to this new spot that's out in deeper water. I let my lure down. I jigged it for just a few minutes, and then, boom, it gets freight trained by something, and I hook into and land just this little pup lake trout. It was about 20 inches. Those are the best length I've found for eating, just personally. Those 20 inches taste really good. So I kept that one for the frying pan, and then I threw my lure down one more time, and literally my buddy's over at the four-wheeler. He's firing it up, literally key in the ignition when my rod almost bends right in half. I thought it was going to snap. I set the hook, and this fish just takes off. And I look at my buddy. I'm like, Bren, this is a big fish. And he comes over. He turns the four-wheeler off, and we all just stand around staring at the hole while I'm holding on, just trying really hard not to mess it up. It's that feeling of excitement when you're so excited that you think if you even blink, if you move your eyelash incorrectly, you're going to screw it up. So I'm trying to stay still, stay like I was, but also fight this fish that I can tell is a hefty fish. And I think it was about 10 minutes later, Bren, he sticks his hand through the ice, 18 inches of water. He got soaked all the way up to his shoulder and grabs the fish to bring it up through the ice. And it was this big old lake trout at 40 inches long. And for a lake trout to qualify for the trophy angler program, it needs to be 36 inches. So that was my first one. I got it down, and that fish, yeah, it was the last time I've been ice fishing, and I don't know if I'll ever go again, but I'm glad I went that day. It was just a great fish, and I was so exhausted after the fight. All the adrenaline dump just left, and I've never been that wore out after a fish, I don't think. Not even, I caught a pretty decent steelhead out of the Niagara River a couple of years ago, and it wasn't as big as his lake trout, but it was the biggest fish I've ever caught out of a river before. And not even that left me as exhausted as this laker did. It just wore me out. So there's the lake trout. I got that down. Well, the next fish, and by this point, like I mentioned earlier, I knew what the trophy angler program was about, and I was actively going for it. So I had that lake trout down. So next thing I did was go after my rainbow trout. And I convinced my wife to help me with this one. It was late February when we went. That lake trout, I think, was mid-February, and I convinced my wife to help me with the rainbow later in the month. Now, my wife, and I'm sure any of the men in this audience who are married can relate to this, my wife doesn't like cold very much at all. And she enjoys fishing, but she's not crazy about it like me. So I convinced her one Sunday after church, said, come with me to the river. It's beautiful weather. It'll be great for you to get out. So we show up to the river, and thank goodness it wasn't windy because, Wyoming, it's always windy here, but it was still just above freezing. And we're bundled up. We wade across the river to the spot that I really like, and I start fishing this nice deep run. And my wife was downstream, and she was fishing, but her rod guides kept icing up, and she wasn't enjoying herself very much. And she was a trooper. She put up with it for a minute. But then she finally did ask to leave, and I said, "You know what? I can't blame you. It's so stinking cold out here." I just said, "One more cast, okay? One last cast." And of course, everybody knows that means however many casts I want before I'm actually ready to leave. So like 5 or 6 casts later, my bobber, I was nymphing, my bobber just shoots under the water. And I feel the weight of a fish that had some serious heft to it, bigger than anything that I'd caught already that day. I'd caught a few whitefish and a couple smaller rainbows. And I look downstream, I tell my wife, "It's a big one." So she grabs the net. She gets really excited. She understood the assignment because she was fishing with one of my old Winstons, and she just throws it into the bushes and grabs the net. And I almost yelled like, "No, don't throw the rod!" But she just grabbed the net, and I was just so happy to have some help. Well, she did a fantastic job of netting this thing. She gets underneath it, slips the net under the fish, and I'm staring at this rainbow in the net, and I couldn't believe it. Took some pictures of it. I measured it, taped out at 25 inches. I could not believe how big of a rainbow it was. So I let it go, and then my wife just looks at me and says, "Okay, that was your last cast. We're out of here." So at that point, I've got my lake trout now, and the rainbow's got to be 20 inches to meet this. So now I have my rainbow trout down. Now it's time for the brown trout. So at this point, I've got 2 of the 5, and I figured the brown trout was going to be the hardest because the brown has to be 23 inches or longer to qualify. And up until this point, I'd never caught a brown trout longer than about 22 inches. And calling my biggest 22 is probably a stretch. It was probably closer to 21. I'd caught a lot of browns. I just never caught some big ones. Now, I was still teaching at this point, but I'd moved to a high school. I started out teaching in middle school, which, given my sense of humor, you can imagine I fit in really well at the middle school. But I wanted to move up to high school for a few reasons, and then we'd actually move to a different part of Wyoming so that I could teach high school. And there's this tailwater around where I live now that everyone told me when I moved up here. They're like, "Dude, you've got to fish that river because it grows huge fish." But I'd been there a handful of times since we moved, and I hadn't caught anything. I'd been skunked. It's a tough river to figure out. But it was right after New Year's. I think it was in 2023. The social studies teacher and I, we were bored on one weekend, so we decided to brave the cold and go fish this river. Now, just to give you an idea how cold it was, we pulled up to the river. It's 14 degrees. The wind just barely kicked up, and it was cold enough that with that wind, within 2 or 3 minutes, just the condensation from my breath had made icicles all over my mustache and my beard, and I couldn't feel my hands. I couldn't feel my fingers. I was having a hard time tying knots. It was the kind of stupid cold where you really shouldn't be out there, but I'd had cabin fever so bad I needed to get out and do something. Plus the wind the wind was blowing, but the sun was shining. So it was this illusion of like, oh, it shouldn't be as cold as it actually feels. And my guides, they iced up, my rod guides iced up literally on the first cast. And we hadn't been there more than 5 minutes before I looked at my buddy. I said, "I think it's just too cold to fish today. Let's just go get some food." And at least we got out of the house. Well, he asked for one more cast. So, of course, we stayed for a little bit. And I throw another drift out there. And my indicator just barely paused. And I'm not even sure how I managed to set the hook here because my fly line was frozen to my rod at this point. It was so cold. But I got the hook set, and the rod just bends in half. There was a serious fish on the end of this. And I get that feeling in my stomach, that nervous excitement that, oh, this is a nice fish. And then I was also worried that my hook set was bad because my line was so frozen and the indicator just barely paused. So it was a really soft eat. So I was really worried that I'd messed up that hook set. And that feeling gets even worse when the fish comes up and he rolls on the surface and the line goes slack for a second. I really thought it was over because the fish, he comes up like he wanted to jump and then realized, oh, it's way too cold. I'm going to freeze if I jump. And then he just went back down. But when he rolled up on the surface like that, the line went slack and my heart just went right into my stomach. I thought, oh no, I'm going to lose it. But my buddy, thank goodness, he chose that moment to almost slip into the drink and go down. And in that case, that could have been really bad because it was so cold. But he nets the fish, he doesn't fall into the river, and we were both just silent for a minute. I remember standing there. There was fresh snow everywhere, like half a foot of it. So it's quiet because of the snow. The only thing you can hear is the water and then the wind just whistling. It's dead quiet everywhere else. And we're just staring at this fish. It's just this glittering bar of metallic butter, is the best way to describe it. A little bit of green thrown in there. Just this gorgeous, picture perfect brown trout. And we measured it because, again, I know what I'm doing. I'm going out for the trophy angler. So I've got a tape measure with me. And we measure it, and it was 23 inches of cold butter on one of the coldest days I have ever had on the water. So that brown, to date, that is still the biggest brown that I've ever caught on a fly. I've caught a bigger brown out of Lake. Which one is it that's by Niagara Falls? I think it's Lake Ontario. I can never remember. I caught a bigger one out of there, but it wasn't on a fly, so it doesn't count. This is the biggest one I ever caught on a fly still. And it met the length qualification because it was 23 inches and it needed to be 23 for the trophy angler. So I catch that brown. I've got 3 out of the 5. I know that I need 2 more. And I want one of them to be a cutthroat trout because I love cutties. Cutties are probably my favorite fish to go for. But the cutthroat trout's got to be 18 inches to qualify. And I'm lucky. I live near a whole bunch of great cutthroat streams. I honestly don't know that I've seen very many fish past maybe 16 inches in a lot of them. There's a lot of fish in there and they get fat, but I haven't seen any really long cutthroat, 18-inch long cutthroat. So I decided that I wanted to try and catch this fish in my favorite river around here. It's this little spring creek that winds its way through moose and willows. There's about as many moose as there are willows on this little stream at like 9,000 feet above sea level. And I fished it really hard during the summer of 2023. I've got the brown under my belt. I'm feeling good. I've got 3 out of the 5, and I caught some nice fish, but nothing that pushed 18. There was one that if you stared at it at the right angle and kind of squinted a little bit, it might have been 18, but it was probably 16. Caught a lot of fish like that. So I went all of 2023 without getting another one. Well, last spring, or getting another one for my trophy angler at that point. And then last spring, so it was spring of 2024, I was headed down to Utah. I was going to go down and film with Alex, and I decided to do something that I rarely do, which is stop and fish on the drive down there. I hate stopping to fish when I'm on a drive to get somewhere because I just want to get where I'm going. I'm a little impatient like that. And when I stop to fish, I want to fish for a while and not just an hour or whatever. And the drive's long enough that I just want to get it over with. So I rarely stop. But I convinced myself that I needed to stop because this particular river, the same place where I caught my big brown, had been fishing so well. It had just been off the hook for the last couple of weeks. So I wanted another crack at it. I wanted to get down there and see what else I could do. So I gave myself an hour. I parked the truck and I slid down to the water. It's a really steep hike down to the river. I actually fell and hurt myself pretty good last summer with Alex on this exact stretch of the river. Anyways, I get down to the water and I start working all the likely holes. I'm fishing pretty fast. I'm just hitting the stuff that should have fish in it. And I'm not really thoroughly covering the water at this point. And just 2 or 3 days earlier, I'd fished this stretch and I'd caught probably 12 fish. So I knew there were fish around, but it was really weird because every spot that should have had a fish in it didn't. They just weren't there. They just did not want to play for whatever reason. And I'm getting a little desperate. I don't want to get skunked, but I also don't want to stay on the water for hours because I just want to get down to Utah. So I'm almost to the spot where I've got to hike out of the canyon and back to my truck when I see this big fish swimming right in front of a boulder. And when they're sitting in front of the boulder like that, it can be kind of tough because unless you see them actively coming up to eat, usually they'll just want to eat nymphs. So you've got to adjust your rig a little bit. So I changed my rig up. I put a bigger dropper on and a heavier dry fly. So I think I threw on a big hopper and then one of our egg bombers that we have here at VFC. And I throw that out there and I had to make a few mends to give the the flies enough time to drop to get in front of that fish. And once I did that, once I got the cast right, boom, that fish ate as soon as I got the drift right. And I thought the other interesting thing too, I saw it sitting in front of the boulder. I thought it was a rainbow. But once I got it in the net, I realized, no, this is a cutthroat. And it was 18 inches long on the money. It was like 18 and 1/16, but I just called it 18. So I grab a picture, I go back to the truck, and then I called Alex and told him all about the fish. And feeling pretty good about myself because at that point, I'm 4 out of the 5. It's early in 2024. I think I'm going to catch my last one this year. I'm going to make it happen. Well, that was in, I think, June. And it wasn't until December of 2024 that I caught 5 out of 5, and that was my whitefish. And I didn't know that I wanted this to be the final fish. I thought about maybe holding out for a brook trout or a golden trout. But the brookies and goldens would need to be 16 inches. And I'm just not tuned in to where the big brookies are in my neck of the woods. Same to go with the goldens. And the tiger trout have to be 20 inches. And I know there's tigers in Wyoming. I just don't know where the really big ones are. So I decided that my last fish was going to be the whitefish because A, I love whitefish. They do not get the love they deserve. They are a fantastic fish. I don't know why Alex doesn't like them. They're a close cousin of the trout. They're native to the West. They fight really well. And they're actually a great indicator of stream health because when water quality starts to diminish, whitefish are usually one of the first fish to disappear from the river system. So if there's whitefish in the river that you're fishing, then you know that you're in a healthy drainage. They run and fight well, like I mentioned. They're just a fun fish. Well, the irony with me deciding that it was going to be the whitefish as my last one is that I've caught plenty over 16 inches, which is the length that you need, but I'd never taken a picture of them. And you have to have a picture to count. So just the end of December, Alex and I are out on the water and we're out filming a little bit and we're sitting in the hotel one night talking all about our favorite fish. And I brought up the trophy angler program and how I was really close. I just needed the big whitey and that had completed. Well, the next morning, we're out on the water. We're freezing our butts off again. That's a common theme through all this, isn't it? And I think the first or second fish that I hooked was the whitefish. It taped it almost exactly 16 inches, just a little bit over. So I had Alex take a picture of me holding it. And just like that, it was almost anticlimactic, but I completed the challenge. I did it. I was a trophy angler. I could put that on my resume. That's going on LinkedIn. That's going everywhere, right? No, it's fun, but it was really satisfying to finish it like that. I caught 5 fish out of 2 separate rivers and 1 lake. One of them through the ice, which is a method that I completely swore off. And then I caught a lot of these when I just least expected them. And to make this podcast not 3 hours long, I omitted a lot of the times when I went to the river and I didn't catch what I was after because this really would be an extremely long podcast if I shared all the failures as well. But it still took me 3 years to complete this challenge. And as I look back on these fish and think about these memories, there's 4 steps that I can identify that I followed each of these when I caught these fish. And I think that's what make them, not just because they're a part of the trophy angler program, but they also stand out for these other reasons too, because of these steps that I've followed. And now this isn't the only process to make a lasting memory when you're out on the water, but I do think through my own years of fishing, my own experience, that the fish I remember the most were the ones where each of these steps was present. And I think these apply to a lot of us. I'd be really interested to hear what y'all think. If there's a step that I maybe missed, or something that you just disagree with completely, I'd love to hear. But step 1 is you got to fish when you can. It was John Gierak who wrote that the best time to go fishing is when you can. And I 100% buy that. That's like a life motto to live by. But you've got to be out on the water. You want to make some memories, get out there when you can. It doesn't always have to be some grand trip that you've planned. Just get out in the water when you can do it. And even if the weather is bad or it's really cold, how many of those fish that I just talked about were caught when the weather was awful or when it was really cold or the middle of winter. All of them except the cutthroat. Cutthroat was the only one that I caught in reasonable weather. That seems to be a really good time to get into big fish is when the weather's less than ideal. And it really does make for a great memory when you look back on it because it feels like Mother Nature's almost fighting you and you've got to stick it out and prevail. So there's a secondary sense of accomplishment when you go out and fight the elements as well as the fish. So that'll be step one is fish when you can. Don't worry about the weather. Obviously, if there's lightning, don't go fishing, right? If there's gale force winds, don't go fishing, but within reason, fish when you can. Step two, you've got to stick with it because it's always the days when I stick to it and I don't just bag things up early that I end up catching fish that I remember because I've got this bad tendency to, honestly, I'll be honest, give up a little bit. If the fishing's not as great as I wanted, or if things just aren't going well, I just pack it up and go home because I live close enough to the fishing and I can fish almost whenever that I've gotten spoiled to the point that I don't really stick it out. I don't have that stamina like I used to. And it's something that I need to definitely tweak about myself. But the days that I actually put these big fish into the net, which with the exception of that cutthroat, which was just pure luck, were all the days that I stuck through it and I pushed through the tough times. That lake trout through the ice, that was a big one. Though the moments when you're able to do that and just stick with it, you're going to make some memories if you can do that. And step three, it's dangerous to go alone, so take a friend. All right. All but one of the fish were caught with somebody else around me. The cutthroat was the only one that I caught on my own. Every other fish, someone was there with me. And sharing these memories with other people make them last longer. There's a power in sharing these memories and experiences with friends and loved ones. And I don't regret a second of the time that I've spent on the water with any of my good friends or my wife. And some of those days, even I don't even remember some of the fish sometimes, but I remember the days more than anything else. And then step four is you've got to always be learning, always be willing to try new things. I gave up ice fishing, said I was never going to do it. I gave it one more shot. I was willing to stop and fish for just an hour when I normally never do that. Okay. I braved 14 degrees in freedom units to catch the brown trout. If you think outside the box a little bit, you're going to surprise yourself at what you're able to accomplish. And I've found that for myself, when I explore up around that bend where I've been told that the fishing isn't all that good, or I head out when the weather's awful, and I just have a great time on the water, I remember those days more than anything else. Okay. And just to drive this home, really drive this home, years ago, when I really fell head over heels for fly fishing, I'd go out and I'd spend the winters, or I'd not the whole winter. I would spend a couple of weekends every winter fishing the Green River at the end of December and 1st of January in Utah. And there was one day when I was out there, I was by myself. It was snowing, and you've got that white snow with the brilliant red rocks of the canyon there on the green. And it was this blissful, just peaceful moment. I was catching some nice fish. And the only other person out in the water that day was a fellow by the name of Ryan Kelly, who's become one of my best friends ever since then. We met, and I don't really remember the fish that day, but I remember the feeling of solitude. And then I remember how much fun it was to meet Ryan and get to talk to him. And those moments really stick out when you're willing to try something new and to do something a little bit outside the box. Now, the only thing I want to end with is, yes, I did set out to catch these fish, and I had an absolute blast doing it, but you do not need a plan to get into some unforgettable fishing. I know a lot of fly anglers love to plan for all the variables. They want to try their best to control the uncontrollable, and when things go sideways, which they often do because that's this sport, those folks can get knocked so far off kilter that they lose sight of the simple joys of fishing. The most memorable trip that I've ever had was one that we never planned for. My buddy Ryan McCullough and I, we ended up in northern Idaho fishing new to us water, all because our options that we'd planned to fish in eastern Washington were high and muddy. And that little river that we found showed off the best hatches I've ever seen in my life. I caught a 21-inch West Slope cutthroat, which was amazing. And we spent 5 days in the woods in absolute paradise. And we still talk about that trip in reverential tones, but we never planned for it. It just kind of happened. So don't let moments like that pass you by, because really, I think that's what fly fishing's all about in the first place.
One of the most frequently asked questions we get from both beginners and experienced anglers is, what fly should I use? With the thousands of fly patterns that exist, it can be completely overwhelming. That's why we've put together an entire ebook that walks you through everything about bugs and picking the right fly, no matter where you're fishing. So if you want to level up your skills and start catching more fish, click or tap the link in the show notes to get this ebook for free. All right, back to the show.
Every week, we spend half the show directly answering questions from viewers and listeners just like yourself. And often the questions y'all send in become the basis for the open of the show as well. So if you've got a question about fly fishing that you would like to have answered, go ahead and send those on in. There's a link to do that in the show notes. And our first question this week comes to us from Tegan from Mississippi. Writes in and says, I'm 16 years old and I'm looking to upgrade my fly fishing setup from the cheap $50 setup I first bought. I mostly fish for bass because that is what is in my neighborhood pond, but the area I'm in has some lakes that have crappie and bluegill. I'm also going to Yellowstone and Grand Teton this August with my family, and I'm wanting to try and fly fish for trout there. I'm looking at several fly fishing combos such as the Redington Wrangler and the Fly Flinger, but I'm stuck on which rod size I should get. Should I go with a 5-weight and just focus on the trout, panfish, crappie, and small bass? Or should I go with a 6-weight in case I hook into a larger fish? Love the podcast and all the advice and info that you share. Well, Tegan, thanks a bunch. I appreciate the question. If you're going to go mostly for bass, but you've also got crappie and bluegill nearby, then I think the 5-weight would be fine. The only thing that you're really going to miss out on with a 5-weight compared to a 6-weight is the extra power to throw really big bass bugs, and then that extra backbone to muscle some of those bigger bass on in. I've fished that Redington Wrangler. It's a good stick. I like the Fly Flinger a bit more, though. It's just a tad bit more sensitive, a little bit slower action, which I think is better for newer anglers because the rod bends. Slower action means the rod bends a little bit more. And with the rod bending a bit more, you can feel more of the casting mechanics. So you can get a better feel for how your cast should look and feel like. That feel, the reason I keep repeating it, is because it's so important. And the more you can feel the line, the more you can understand, okay, this is what a good cast feels like. This is how it should look. This is how it should behave. And some of the other cheaper rods out there, they're very stiff, which can be good and bad. They're a little bit easier to learn how to cast, but they're also a little bit harder to understand the better casting mechanics on, in my opinion. So when I was guiding and teaching a lot of folks, I always recommended using a medium fast instead of a fast rod. So a rod that bends a little bit more instead of one that doesn't bend very much. And you can also land just plenty of big fish on a 5-weight. Alex caught his 25 1/4 inch, and that 1/4 inch makes all the difference. His 25 1/4 inch rainbow, his personal best fish ever, on the Fly Flinger, on a 5-weight. A 6-weight does make landing those bigger fish a little bit easier, but a 5-weight's going to do everything that the 6-weight will, but the 6-weight's just going to throw those heavier flies easier, fight bigger fish easier. But then the 5-weight has a bit more versatility when it comes to throwing flies for trout or feeling the bite from those smaller panfish. So again, with what you said, I think the 5-weight's going to serve you best. A few years ago, went down to Lake Powell and fished for 3 or 4 days there. And I only brought my 5-weight with me, and I fished bass the whole time. Caught a few crappie as well, but I caught smallmouth, largemouth, and then one of us caught a walleye, and I can't remember if it was me or my buddy. But I caught smallmouth and largemouth on the 5 weight just fine. I even threw a drop shot rig on the 5 weight to get my flies a little bit deeper for some of the bigger bass, and I was able to do that okay. A 6 weight would have been a little bit easier, but on the smaller fish, I could feel the bites very well on the 5 weight. So that's the trade off: is you lose a little bit of sensitivity for the ability to throw bigger bugs and fight bigger fish a little bit better. So I think that 5 weight's probably going to serve you the best though. If you need any more clarification, don't hesitate to reach on out. Stephanie from Colorado's got her next question, writes in and says, love the podcast, recently found it and have been binging it and learning a lot. How often do you change flies or nymphs? So you go to the river and either go with a solid set of flies or hopper dropper rig, like a hopper to a zebra midge, and then the fish aren't biting. I've been working more lately on trying to get it to the right depth in the water column, but how long do you fish a setup before changing? Also, I love my scene and use it whenever I go out to try to match the hatch. Thanks. Stephanie, great question. It's a good one. And for those who may not know, a seine, it's a little mesh net, a very fine mesh that you just stick in the river and you hold it there for a minute. You pull it out of the water and it'll collect all the bugs and everything else that's drifting through the water, so you can get an idea of what bugs are in the current and currently available to the fish to eat. So my thought on changing flies: you get to the river and you tie your confidence rig on. You tie your flies on that you feel good about, like Stephanie mentioned, her hopper to a zebra midge, and that's not working. When do you change it? Well, what I counsel and what I practice, I do the same thing myself. This isn't just something that I tell everybody to do and then I don't do it. I follow this as well. I don't change my flies unless I am certain that I've made a fantastic presentation in a variety of waters, or I see something that tells me I need to. Now, what that would look like is, let's say I get to the river and I put a caddis on with a Frenchie dropper, and then I watch a fish come up and eat pale morning dun, a mayfly. At that point, I would probably cut off my caddis and put a mayfly on, because I just watched a fish eat a mayfly. So when you have something that hits you in the face that obvious, yes, change your flies at that point. But unless something like that happens, I want to get a great presentation with my rig in a few different water types, okay? If I get a great drift through some riffles, but I don't get any fish, I don't just change my flies immediately, because the fish might not be in the riffles, or there might not have been any fish in those riffles. I'm going to go fish a run, a pool, or even another set of riffles, and I'm going to focus on getting a great presentation. Make sure that I've got a drag-free drift. Make sure, if I'm fishing a nymph rig, that my nymphs are in the strike zone. If it's a dry dropper rig, make sure that dropper is in the strike zone. Make sure that I'm letting those flies drift for long enough, that I'm not pulling them out too soon. Make sure that I'm covering the water effectively. Okay. If I'm in a run, I'm covering it in a grid pattern. Same with a riffle. I'm looking for rising fish, looking for active fish, and casting to them. If I've done that 2 or 3 times, and I'm confident that I've done it as well as I can and that I've really made some good presentations, that's when I will start looking to change my flies. Because at that point, then yes, it makes sense to make a few changes. Okay. But I only do that after I've presented them very well, because how a fly is presented is way more important than what fly is being presented. Okay. And just to drive that home, Alex and I are out on this river earlier this summer, and we knew there were stonefly nymphs everywhere, and there were stonefly adults everywhere. They were crawling all over us. So we knew we just needed to throw a stonefly nymph on, and we'd probably be in business. And I had on a Pat's rubber legs, and I think Alex had on either a big Frenchie or a big hare's ear. And anything that resembled a stonefly at all, any fly, was working for us. Any stonefly-esque nymph was working very well for us that day. We matched the size and shape. The presentation was on point. The fly pattern itself didn't really matter. We caught a lot of fish on different stonefly nymphs all day long. So that just drives home this point. even further. But that's how I approach it, and that's what I recommend y'all do as well. So thanks for sending that question on in, Stephanie. I appreciate it. Oliver from Arizona has our next question, writes in and says, I'm a beginner / intermediate fly fisher and wanted some 2 cents on waders. How do you pick them? What type of boots to use? And is it something that you can get away with spending a little bit less money on? Just wanting a short yet descriptive answer. Love the podcast. Well, thank you, Oliver. Appreciate it. And this is a great question. Waders are tough because we buy them knowing that they're going to fail eventually. So it's a tough value prop for companies to ask us to buy a product that we'll eventually throw away. It's really kind of weird when you think about it. But my recommendation is to just buy the best that you can afford, because by and large, the more expensive waders just do last longer. They fit better and they're more comfortable than the cheap ones. And I can see the comments now. There's gonna be somebody saying, "Well, I've been fishing this pair of Cabela's waders for 20 years and I don't have a leak." Awesome, that's great. And I'm not telling you that you're wrong. I'm just telling you that experience is the exception, and it does not line up with my experience, with Alex's experience, with the vast, vast majority of the anglers I know. The folks who are on the water consistently, they're using those cheap waders and they just don't last very long. Okay. Case in point, I had a pair from Sportsman's Warehouse that I returned 5 times because they kept splitting. The seams kept splitting in the same exact spot on each pair of waders. And then I also had a similar experience with Redington, who coincidentally doesn't make waders or any wading gear anymore. But the common thread between all of them was they were cheap. They were low-end pairs. They didn't fit very well at all. Okay. They just didn't last very long. The fit is incredibly important to how durable your waders are going to be, because the waders, there's high wear areas. And if they're too baggy or if they're too tight, then you're putting extra strain on areas that aren't designed for it. And that's going to wear them out longer. And a lot of the more expensive waders fit better. They can spend more time in really tailoring them to our individual sizes. And just to drive that point home, I've got a pair of RS waders from Squala and the Boundary waders from Grundens, and then the new G4Zs from Sims. And I put all of them through the ringer for some gear reviews. And so far, each of those pairs of waders has lasted through some serious abuse. I've had those RS waders the longest. I've used them the longest. And they finally sprung a leak after close to 150 days of fishing in them. I still need to send them into Squala to get them fixed, but they finally sprung that leak after like 150 fishing days. And I understand $700 or more. That's a lot of money to spend on a pair of waders. I get it. It is not an easy check to write, but if you're going to fish more than 20 days a year, I really think they're worth the investment. Okay. If you're on the water 10 to 15 days a year, the cheap ones are going to be the better bang for your buck. No questions asked. All right. But if you're fishing every 2 weeks, roughly, that gets us to about 20 days a year, then it's worth investing in the better waders, the stuff that's not going to just spring a leak on you randomly. It will be a better experience, I promise. And you don't have to spend the $700. There's some in the $500 range that are better, but just even the step above the entry-level stuff from Sportsman's or Cabela's or Bass Pro, the stuff that's a step above that is going to be better. Okay. Even the lower end Sim stuff, Orvis makes some lower end ones. Squala's, I'm blanking on the names. The carbon waders, I think, are $500, which, yes, that's still spendy, but it's not $800 like some waders are, or $1,000 like some are now. So there's some that don't cost $700 or $1,000. That's the point. But spend a little bit more on them if you're on the water consistently. You will thank me. And then as far as boots goes, this is really easy. Go with Corkers. They make great boots. The Stealth sneaker, I think it's like $150. And that thing is amazing. It's super light. Been pretty durable. It's held up really well to my abuse and to Alex's abuse. He's got a pair of them as well. Their chrome light boot is just a little bit more than that, but it's also great. And honestly, that's what I would recommend for just about everybody, because unless you hike a lot or you're on the water like 150 days a year or more, then those two boots are going to serve you extremely, extremely well. So thank you for the question. I really appreciate it. And with that, folks, we are going to wrap up the Q&A section of the show this week, but don't go anywhere because we've got the Live Your Life moment coming right up. Every week, we end the show with a story from someone in the VFC audience who's out there on the water living real life. We love to hear your stories and to share the stories and pictures of you out there living real life. So if you've got a Live Real Life moment you would like to share, send that into us via the link in the show notes. And this week's Live Real Life moment is from Jace. Writes in and says, "Hey VFC team, I wanted to share a pretty cool experience I had a week ago when I went out to South Central Utah in search of newer water to fish. Suffice to say, it was a massive success and I only have VFC to thank. Last week, I became inspired after watching the video Discover New Fishing Spots. Being a new fly angler myself, finding places to fish has always been a challenge. I hate being that guy who always asks other people for advice on where to go and what to use, so I decided to just get out there and figure it out on my own. Following the DIY section of the guide described in the video, I opened up maps, downloaded Onyx, and went off for an adventure. The destination that I scouted on my apps was a reservoir within a popular mountain range, but it wasn't the reservoir that I wanted. It was the creek that fed out of it. The creek cut through a beautiful forested canyon, which made for an amazing hike. Once I got down low enough, I found multiple deep pools teeming with feeding rainbows, cutthroat, and cutbows. All of the fish were seeming to rise for either midges or blue-winged olives. Can't tell yet, still learning my bug science. So I got to try out dry fly fishing for the first time. I followed Spencer's favorite fishing technique and went for a dry dropper rig. I tied on a size 14 BWO, then a size 18 beta sniff dropper, and had the best fishing I have ever experienced in my life. Tons of fish on the dry fly and plenty of fish on the nymph. It was stellar. Among the many other first times, I caught 2 fish on the same drift. It was incredible. I had heard mention of people having this happen to them, but never thought I would see it in person, let alone happen to me. All I have to say is that this wouldn't have happened if I didn't follow Alex's guide on how to find places to fish. Thanks, Team VFC. You guys are hands down the best source of information for anything and everything fly fishing. You made me a much more confident angler with your content." Well, Jace, thank you so much. I really appreciate that. This is a fantastic story. I showed it to Alex, and he's stoked too. Man, this is awesome. This is why we do this. This is why VFC exists, is to help people have experiences like Jace just had. And these Live Real Life moments, they get submitted, and I just read them in order that they got submitted. I look at it when I put the show together, but I don't only pick the ones that make VFC look good. So this is all organic, and Jace, thank you so much, man. That means a lot to hear that you had such a great time, and congrats on getting out there. I know it can be a little intimidating, but it's awesome. It's so fun when you go out, you try it, and it just clicks. It is so much fun, and it is so satisfying, and I will venture to say you're probably going to be addicted for the rest of your life, so you're welcome. Well, with that, folks, we're going to wrap up the show this week. Thanks so much for listening to the whole thing. We really appreciate it. If you could, please rate and subscribe to the show wherever you're listening to it. The more ratings and subscriptions we get, the more folks we can reach and help live real life. And speaking of that, I think we're out of this deep Arctic freeze that we were in, so get out on the water. And if you can't get out fishing, we've got a ton of great resources. There's links everywhere to go check out our other stuff. So do that. And until next week, everybody, live real life.